in the heart of Atlanta's Vine City neighborhood, where the morning sun painted golden streaks across weathered brownstones. 8-year-old Marcus Washington sat at his grandmother's kitchen table, carefully working on his homework. The smell of cornbread and collard greens filled the small apartment, mixing with the sound of Mama Rose humming an old spiritual as she prepared for another long night ahead. "Baby, you make sure you finish that math before I leave for work," Mama Rose called from the bedroom, her voice carrying the weight of 67 years of wisdom and struggle. She emerged wearing her navy blue uniform, the name tag reading Rose Washington Cleaning Services pinned proudly to her chest. Marcus looked up from his multiplication tables, concern creasing his young brow. "Mama Rose, why do you have to work so late every night?" His grandmother sat beside him, her weathered hands gentle as she smoothed his hair. "Sometimes, baby, we got to do what we got to do to take care of the ones we love. Your mama would be proud seeing how smart you're getting." The mention of his mother, who had passed when Marcus was just 5, brought a familiar ache to his chest. But Mama Rose's presence had always been his anchor, her stories about their ancestors who overcame impossible odds giving him strength. "Now, you remember what I always tell you about our people," she continued, her eyes twinkling with the kind of wisdom that comes from living through history. "Even the smallest voice can move mountains when it carries truth. Our great-great-grandparents knew that. They fought for freedom with nothing but faith and determination." Marcus nodded solemnly. He'd heard these stories countless times, but they never got old. They were his inheritance, more valuable than any treasure. The phone rang, interrupting their moment. Mama Rose answered, her face growing serious as she listened. "I understand, Mrs. Patterson. Thank you for calling." She hung up and turned to Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Baby, I got some hard news. The community center. They're talking about closing it down." Marcus felt his world tilt. The East Side Community Center was everything to him and dozens of other kids in the neighborhood. It was where he went after school while Mama Rose worked, where Ms. Johnson helped him with his reading, where he played basketball with his friends, and where he felt safe and loved. "But why, Mama Rose? Who would do that to us?" His grandmother sighed deeply. "Mrs. Patterson says it's about money. The big company that gives them funding is cutting back. Pinnacle Industries, where I work nights cleaning their offices. The CEO, Mr. Sterling, he's making decisions about which programs to keep." Marcus's 8-year-old mind began working furiously. "The same building where you work, where you clean." "That's right, baby. Been cleaning those offices for 15 years now. See all kinds of important people come and go, making decisions that affect folks like us." That night, as Mama Rose left for her shift at Pinnacle Industries, Marcus lay in bed thinking about the community center. He thought about little Keisha from down the hall, who was learning to read there. He thought about old Mr. Thompson, who taught them chess and told them stories about the civil rights movement. He thought about all the kids who had nowhere else to go, whose parents worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. But most of all, he thought about Mama Rose's words. Even the smallest voice can move mountains when it carries truth. As dawn broke over Atlanta, Marcus had made a decision that would change everything. He was going to write a letter to CEO Robert Sterling. Not just any letter, but one that would carry the truth about what the community center meant to people like him. He would tell the story Mama Rose had taught him about their ancestors, about courage in the face of impossible odds, and about how sometimes the smallest person can make the biggest difference. He didn't know it yet, but his letter would do more than save a community center. It would awaken something in a powerful man's heart that had been sleeping for far too long. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the East Side Community Center as Marcus sat at one of the donated computers, his small fingers hunting and pecking across the keyboard. He'd been there since they opened at 7 a.m., researching everything he could find about Robert Sterling, CEO of Pinnacle Industries. "What you working on so hard, Marcus?" asked Keisha. His 7-year-old neighbor who'd become his best friend since her family moved to the building last year. I'm going to write a letter to the man who wants to close our center, Marcus replied. His voice filled with the kind of determination that reminded everyone of his grandmother. Mama Rose always says you got to know who you're talking to if you want them to listen. Keisha's older brother Jamal, 16 and wise beyond his years, pulled up a chair. You talking about Sterling? Man, that dude's like a billionaire. You think he's gonna listen to a kid? Marcus turned to face them both, his young face serious. Mama Rose told me our great-great-grandmother once walked 50 miles to talk to the governor about keeping their school open. She was just a poor woman with nothing but courage and truth. And you know what? She got that meeting. As Marcus scrolled through articles about Sterling, something caught his attention. Look here, he said, pointing at the screen. This article says Mr. Sterling grew up in a neighborhood just like ours. It says his mama was a single mother, and he spent time at a community center when he was little. Jamal leaned in closer. For real. So he knows what it's like. That's what this says. But look at this picture. Marcus pointed to a recent photo of Sterling in an expensive suit, standing in front of his corporate headquarters. He looks like he might have forgotten. Keisha tugged on Marcus's sleeve. My mama says sometimes grown-ups forget what it was like to be little. Maybe he just needs someone to remind him. Marcus spent the next hour crafting his letter, writing and rewriting each sentence. He told Sterling about the center, about the kids who depended on it, about the homework help and the hot meals and the feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself. He wrote about Mama Rose, about their family's history of fighting for their community, and about how the center was carrying on that tradition. But most importantly, he wrote about hope. About how the center wasn't just a building, but a place where dreams were nurtured and where kids like him learned that they could become anything they set their minds to. This is good, Marcus, Jamal said after reading the letter. But how you gonna get it to him? You can't just mail it. He probably gets thousands of letters. Marcus had been thinking about that too. I found out he's coming to the Pinnacle building next Tuesday for a big meeting about community funding. If I can get there. That's a crazy plan, little man, Jamal interrupted. You can't just walk into a corporate building and demand to see the CEO. But Marcus wasn't deterred. He'd learned from his grandmother's stories that sometimes the most important things required the biggest leaps of faith. Mama Rose always says that closed doors are just opportunities to find another way in. Keisha nodded enthusiastically. I'll help. We can figure this out together. Even Jamal, despite his skepticism, found himself drawn into the planning. All right, but if we're gonna do this, we need to be smart about it. We can't just show up with no plan. They spent the afternoon mapping out the Pinnacle Industries building, using Street View and corporate websites to understand the layout. Marcus would need to get past security, navigate the floors, and somehow find his way to wherever Sterling would be meeting. You know what, Marcus? Jamal said as they prepared to leave the center that evening. Whether this works or not, what you're doing is brave. You're standing up for something that matters. Marcus folded his letter carefully and put it in his backpack. Mama Rose says courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared. As they walked home through their neighborhood, past the corner store where Mr. Ahmed always gave them free candy, past the mural of Dr. King that watched over their street, Marcus felt the weight of his mission. He was carrying more than just a letter. He was carrying the hopes of his community, the wisdom of his ancestors, and the unshakable belief that truth and courage could move mountains. Tuesday couldn't come soon enough. Tuesday morning arrived with a kind of crisp November air that made Atlanta's skyline shimmer in the distance. Marcus stood outside the imposing glass towers of Pinnacle Industries, his grandmother's words echoing in his mind. Baby, sometimes the Lord opens doors we never expected to walk through. The building stretched 30 floors into the sky, its reflective surface making Marcus feel smaller than ever. But he squared his shoulders, feeling the letter in his backpack like a talisman, and approached the security desk. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said to the uniformed guard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to see Mr. Sterling, please." Officer Johnson, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying temples, looked down at the small boy with surprise. "Son, you can't just walk in here asking to see the CEO. This is a business building." Marcus's heart sank, but he remembered his grandmother's teachings about persistence. "Sir, I know it sounds crazy, but I have something really important to tell him. It's about the community center where I go after school. They're going to close it, and I wrote him a letter." Something in Marcus's earnest tone made Officer Johnson pause. The guard had been working security for 20 years, and he'd seen plenty of people try to get past him with wild stories. But this kid was different. There was something pure about his determination. "What's your name, son?" "Marcus Washington. My grandmama works here at night, cleaning the offices. Her name is Rose Washington." Officer Johnson's expression changed completely. "Rose Washington. That sweet lady who always asks about my granddaughter. She's been working here longer than I have." Marcus nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. She talks about you sometimes. Says you're one of the good ones." The guard found himself in an impossible position. He had strict orders about who could enter the building, but something about this situation felt different. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw something that reminded him of his own grandson. "You know what, Marcus? I can't promise anything, but today's your lucky day. Mr. Sterling is here for a board meeting, and I just happen to know he's running late. There's a service elevator that goes straight to the executive floor. If you were to accidentally find yourself in that elevator..." Marcus's eyes widened. "You mean..." "I mean I'm going to walk over there and check on something else for exactly 3 minutes. What happens during those 3 minutes, well, that's between you and the Lord." As Officer Johnson turned away, Marcus felt a surge of gratitude and terror. This was his chance, but the executive floor seemed as far away as the moon. He slipped into the service elevator, his heart pounding as the numbers climbed. 15, 20, 25, 28. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Marcus stepped into a world he'd never imagined. The hallway was lined with marble, and through glass doors he could see conference rooms filled with people in expensive suits. Following the sound of voices, Marcus found himself standing outside a boardroom where he could hear someone speaking about optimizing community investments and maximizing shareholder value. The words were confusing, but the tone was clear. They were talking about cutting funding. Marcus took a deep breath, thinking about all the kids at the center, about Mama Rose working nights to support their family, about his ancestors who had faced much bigger challenges with nothing but faith and determination. He knocked on the door. The room fell silent. Through the glass, Marcus could see a dozen people in suits sitting around a massive table. At the head of the table sat a man in his 50s with silver hair and tired eyes. Robert Sterling. The door opened, and a woman in a sharp business suit looked down at Marcus with confusion and irritation. "Excuse me, how did you get up here?" "Security." But Sterling raised his hand. "Wait." He looked at Marcus with curiosity rather than anger. "Son, how did you get in here?" Marcus's voice was small but steady. "Mr. Sterling, sir, I'm Marcus Washington. I wrote you a letter about our community center, and I really need to talk to you." The boardroom buzzed with uncomfortable murmurs. Someone whispered about calling security. Another person suggested they continue with the meeting. But Sterling continued to stare at Marcus, something flickering in his eyes. "Marcus Washington," he repeated slowly. "What's your grandmother's name?" "Rose Washington, sir. She works here at night, cleaning the offices." Sterling's expression changed completely. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, then at the faces around the table, then back at Marcus. "Well, Marcus Washington," he said finally, "it seems like you've got something important to say. Why don't you come in?" The boardroom fell silent as Marcus stepped inside, his small sneakers squeaking against the polished marble floor. 12 of the most powerful people in Atlanta's business community stared at him, their faces a mixture of confusion, amusement, and impatience. At the head of the table, Robert Sterling gestured to an empty chair. "Please, Marcus, have a seat and tell us what's so important that you found a way past our security." Marcus climbed into the oversized leather chair, his feet dangling above the floor. The letter in his backpack felt heavier than ever, but he remembered Mama Rose's words about truth and courage. He pulled out the carefully folded paper and began to speak. "Mr. Sterling, sir, and everybody else," Marcus began, his voice small but growing stronger with each word. "I'm here about the East Side Community Center. I heard you're thinking about not giving them money anymore, and I wanted to tell you what that place means to me and my friends." A woman in a navy suit checked her watch impatiently. "Mr. Sterling, perhaps we should—" "Let him speak," Sterling interrupted, his eyes fixed on Marcus. Marcus took a deep breath and began to tell his story. "Every day after school, I go to the center because that's where I'm safe. My mama died when I was little, and my grandmama Mama Rose takes care of me. She works here every night, cleaning your offices so I can have food and clothes and a place to live." He paused, looking around the room at faces that were beginning to soften. "At the center, Ms. Johnson helps me with my reading. I used to be scared of big words, but now I can read chapter books. And Mr. Thompson, he teaches us chess and tells us stories about people who fought for what was right, even when it was hard." Marcus's voice grew more passionate as he continued. "But it's not just about homework and games. The center is where I learned about my history, about where I come from. Mama Rose always tells me stories about our ancestors, about how they never gave up even when things seemed impossible." He stood up in his chair, his small frame somehow commanding the attention of every person in the room. "She tells me about my great-great-grandmother who walked 50 miles to talk to the governor about keeping their school open. About my great-grandfather who started the first Negro Business League in our neighborhood. About people who understood that when you lift up one person, you lift up the whole community." The room was completely silent now. Even the woman who had been checking her watch was listening intently. "The center isn't just a building," Marcus continued, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "It's hope. It's where little kids like my friend Keisha learn that they can become doctors or teachers or even CEOs like you, Mr. Sterling. It's where teenagers like Jamal learn that they have value and that someone believes in them." Marcus looked directly at Sterling, his young eyes filled with wisdom beyond his years. "Mama Rose works in this building every night, cleaning up after important people who make important decisions. She never complains, even when her back hurts or when she's tired. She just keeps working because she believes in taking care of people." He pulled out his letter and unfolded it carefully. "I wrote this letter because I wanted you to know that the center saves lives. Not just by keeping kids safe, but by showing them that they matter, that they have potential, that they can grow up to be anything they want to be." Marcus's voice grew stronger as he reached the heart of his message. "Mama Rose taught me that our ancestors survived slavery, segregation, and so much pain because they never forgot to take care of each other. The community center is how we keep doing that. It's how we make sure no child feels alone or forgotten." The boardroom was so quiet that the only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Several board members were wiping their eyes, and Sterling himself was staring at Marcus with an expression of wonder and recognition. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus concluded, "I know you're busy and important, and I know you have to make hard choices about money. But I wanted you to know that if you save our center, you're not just saving a building. You're saving dreams. You're saving hope. You're saving the future." Marcus sat back down in his chair, suddenly exhausted. He had said everything he came to say, poured his heart out in front of these powerful strangers. Now all he could do was wait and hope that his words had been enough. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Finally, Sterling spoke, his voice unusually quiet. "Marcus," he said slowly, "you mentioned your grandmother Rose Washington. Tell me, how long has she been working here?" 15 years, sir. She started when I was just a baby." Sterling nodded slowly, something working behind his eyes. "And she's always worked the night shift?" "Yes, sir. She says it pays better, and she needs the money to take care of me." Sterling was quiet for another moment, then looked around the table at his fellow board members. "I think we need to hear more about this community center. Marcus, would you be willing to tell us some more about what goes on there?" Marcus nodded eagerly, hope beginning to bloom in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, his grandmother had been right about the power of truth and courage after all. Robert Sterling leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with an intensity that made the young boy fidget. The other board members exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the meeting had taken. Margaret Chen, the chief financial officer, cleared her throat. "Robert, while this is certainly touching, we do have a schedule to maintain and shareholders to consider." But Sterling raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "Marcus, you said your grandmother has been working here for 15 years. That would put her start date around 2010. Tell me, does she ever talk about the people she meets here?" Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes, sir. Mama Rose says she's met all kinds of people over the years. She says some of them are nice and some of them are too busy to notice her, but she prays for all of them anyway." Sterling's expression grew more thoughtful. "Has she ever mentioned meeting someone who was struggling? Someone who might have been working late, maybe looked like they needed help?" Marcus's eyes lit up with recognition. "You mean like the story about the young man who used to work really late? The one who looked so tired and hungry that she started sharing her lunch with him?" The room went completely still. Sterling's face had gone pale, and his hands were gripping the edge of the table. "Tell me about that story, Marcus." Marcus settled back in his chair, slipping into the comfortable rhythm of storytelling that his grandmother had taught him. "Well, Mama Rose says this was years ago when I was just a little baby. She was working her usual night shift, and she noticed this young man who would stay in the building really late. He was always hunched over his desk, looking stressed and tired." Sterling's breathing had become shallow, but he motioned for Marcus to continue. "Mama Rose said he reminded her of her own son, my daddy before he passed, working so hard to make something of himself. So one night she knocked on his office door and asked if he was okay. He told her he was fine, but she could see he was struggling." Marcus's voice took on the cadence of his grandmother's storytelling, rich with warmth and wisdom. "She said this young man told her he was trying to prove himself, that he came from a poor neighborhood and didn't want to let his family down. He was working 18-hour days, barely eating, just trying to make it in the business world." The board members were now listening with rapt attention, sensing that something significant was unfolding. "So you know what Mama Rose did?" Marcus continued. "She started bringing extra food in her lunch bag. Every night, she'd leave a sandwich and some fruit on his desk with a little note. She'd write things like, 'Remember to take care of yourself,' and 'You're going to do great things.'" Sterling's eyes were now filled with tears, though he was clearly trying to maintain his composure. "And the best part," Marcus said, his voice growing excited, "is what she told him the last time they talked. She said, 'Baby, I can see you're going to be somebody important someday. Just promise me you'll remember where you come from and always take care of the people who need lifting up.'" The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling sat perfectly still for a long moment, then slowly turned to look out the window at the city skyline. "Marcus," he said quietly, What did your grandmother say happened to that young man? Marcus shrugged. She said he got promoted and moved to a different floor, then eventually left the company to start his own business. She always wondered what happened to him, hoped he was happy and successful. Sterling turned back to face the room, his professional mask completely gone. Marcus, I need to tell you something. 30 years ago, I was a 25-year-old intern working in this building. I was scared, overwhelmed, and working myself to death trying to prove I belonged here. The board members sat in stunned silence as their CEO continued. I came from a neighborhood not unlike yours, Marcus. My mother worked 3 jobs to support my sister and me. I had gotten this internship through a scholarship program, and I felt like I had to work twice as hard as everyone else just to prove I deserved to be here. Sterling's voice grew softer. I was surviving on vending machine food and about 4 hours of sleep a night. I was on the verge of a breakdown when your grandmother appeared at my office door like an angel. She fed me, encouraged me, and most importantly, she reminded me that success without compassion is just another form of failure. Marcus's eyes were wide with wonder. You're the young man from Mama Rose's story. I am, Sterling confirmed. And I'm ashamed to say that somewhere along the way, I forgot the lesson she taught me. I forgot about taking care of people who need lifting up. I forgot where I came from. The room erupted in whispers and murmurs. Margaret Chen looked like she was seeing her CEO for the first time. The other board members were exchanging glances of amazement and confusion. Sterling stood up and walked around the table to where Marcus sat. Your grandmother saved my life, Marcus. Not just by feeding me, but by showing me that kindness and compassion are the most important qualities a person can have. And here you are, 30 years later, carrying on her legacy. He knelt down beside Marcus's chair. You came here today to save your community center, but you've done something much more important. You've reminded me who I used to be, and who I still want to be. Marcus looked up at this powerful man who was kneeling beside him with tears in his eyes. Does this mean you'll help save the center? Sterling smiled through his tears. Marcus, I'm going to do much more than that. I'm going to make sure your grandmother's wisdom lives on in everything this company does from now on. The boardroom had transformed from a sterile corporate environment into something that felt alive with possibility. Sterling stood before his board members, his usual commanding presence now softened by genuine emotion and renewed purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there an hour earlier. We need to completely reconsider our approach to community investment, not just for the East Side Community Center, but for our entire corporate social responsibility program. Margaret Chen looked up from her notes, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. Robert, what exactly are you proposing? Sterling placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder. I'm proposing that we create the Marcus Washington Community Investment Program. Instead of cutting funding to community centers, we're going to increase it significantly. The room buzzed with surprised murmurs. David Rodriguez, the VP of Operations, leaned forward. That's a substantial shift in strategy, Robert. What's the business case? The business case, Sterling replied, is that 30 years ago, a night janitor in this building saw potential in a scared young intern and invested in his future. That investment led to the creation of Pinnacle Industries and thousands of jobs. Now it's time to pay that forward. Marcus watched in amazement as Sterling began outlining his vision. We're going to establish a $50 million endowment for community centers throughout Atlanta. But more than that, we're going to create mentorship programs, scholarship funds, and educational partnerships. Sterling turned to Marcus. And I want you to be our first youth ambassador. Your job will be to help us understand what kids in your community really need and want. Marcus's eyes were wide with disbelief. Me? But I'm just a kid. You're not just a kid, Marcus. You're a young man with courage, wisdom, and the ability to move mountains. Today you proved that age has nothing to do with leadership. The board members who had started the meeting focused on cost-cutting and efficiency, now found themselves caught up in Sterling's enthusiasm. Even Margaret Chen, known for her fiscal conservatism, was nodding thoughtfully. There's something else, Sterling continued. Rose Washington has been cleaning our offices for 15 years, working nights to support her family. It's time we recognized her true value. I'm creating a new position, community liaison, and I want her to be our first hire. Marcus gasped. You mean Mama Rose won't have to clean offices anymore? She'll still work here, but her job will be to help us understand the communities we serve. She'll be our bridge between the corporate world and the neighborhoods that need our support. Sterling walked to the window and looked out at the city. You know, Marcus, when I was your age, I thought success meant climbing as high as you could and never looking back. Your grandmother taught me that real success means reaching down and pulling others up with you. He turned back to the room. We're going to restructure our entire approach to corporate citizenship. Instead of treating community investment as charity, we're going to treat it as what it really is, an investment in our future. Over the next hour, the board meeting transformed into a planning session. They discussed creating after-school programs, funding college scholarships, and establishing business mentorship opportunities. Marcus found himself at the center of the conversation, his insights and ideas valued as much as those of the seasoned executives. Marcus, Margaret Chen said, you mentioned that older kids like Jamal sometimes feel forgotten. What kind of programs do you think would help them? Marcus thought carefully. Well, Jamal is really good with computers, but he doesn't think he could ever work somewhere like this. Maybe if he could meet people who do those kinds of jobs, see that it's possible for someone like him. Job shadowing programs, David Rodriguez nodded. Internships. We could partner with local high schools. As the meeting drew to a close, Sterling made one final announcement. I want to invite Marcus and his grandmother to our next board meeting. Rose Washington's wisdom guided this company's early success, and I believe her grandson's vision can help guide our future. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the newly renovated East Side Community Center, watching dozens of kids participate in programs that hadn't existed before his visit to Pinnacle Industries. There was a computer lab funded by the corporation, a mentorship program pairing community kids with business professionals, and a scholarship fund that would help graduates pursue higher education. Mama Rose, now wearing a badge that read Community Liaison, was leading a group of Pinnacle executives on a tour of the facility. You see, she was explaining, when you invest in a child's potential, you're not just changing one life. You're changing generations. Marcus found himself thinking about the story his grandmother had told him so many times. About their ancestors who never gave up, who fought for their communities with nothing but faith and determination. He realized now that he was part of that continuing story, that his courage to speak truth to power had created ripples that would spread far beyond anything he could have imagined. Keisha ran up to him, her face beaming with excitement. Marcus, guess what? I got accepted into the advanced reading program. Ms. Johnson says I might be able to skip a grade. As Marcus watched his friend's joy, he understood something profound about the nature of change. It didn't always come from the top down or through grand gestures. Sometimes it came from the bottom up, from the voices of those who had been overlooked, from the simple act of believing that every person has value and potential. Later that evening, as Marcus and Mama Rose walked home through their neighborhood, she put her arm around his shoulders. Baby, you know what you did today? I helped save the community center. You did more than that, Marcus. You reminded a powerful man about the importance of remembering where you come from. You showed him that success isn't about how high you climb, but about how many people you bring with you on the journey. Marcus looked up at his grandmother, this woman who had worked nights for 15 years to give him a better life, who had shared her lunch with a struggling young man and changed the course of his life with simple kindness. Mama Rose, You always said that even the smallest voice can move mountains when it carries truth. She smiled, her eyes twinkling with pride and love. That's right, baby. And today your voice moved more than mountains. It moved hearts. As they walked past the mural of Dr. King, past the corner store where Mr. Ahmed waved from behind the counter, past the sounds of children playing in the evening air, Marcus felt the weight of his heritage and the promise of his future. He was part of a long line of people who had refused to accept that things couldn't change, who had believed in the power of community and the strength that comes from lifting each other up. The next morning, Marcus would return to the community center, now thriving with new programs and possibilities. He would tell the other kids the story of how a small act of courage had transformed not just their center, but an entire corporation's approach to community investment. He would share the folktale his grandmother had taught him about the smallest seed growing into the mightiest tree when planted with love and watered with persistence. But tonight, as he drifted off to sleep in his small bedroom, Marcus Washington knew that he had become part of the story himself. He had proven that age doesn't determine the size of your impact, that truth spoken with courage can change the world, and that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who remembers where they came from and isn't afraid to speak up for those who need a voice. The community center was saved, but more importantly, a new generation had learned that they had the power to shape their own destiny and the responsibility to lift up others along the way. And in the heart of Atlanta, where the morning sun would soon paint golden streaks across weathered brownstones, hope had taken root and was growing stronger every day.